All right, today is April the 23rd in 2024, and my guest is Bradley Tusk. Bradley is one of the guests I've been most looking to get on this show, as you can easily see from his bio. Bradley is a co founder of Tusk Venture Partners and invests in early stage technology companies operating in highly regulated industries. Sounds familiar? Bradley was also, yeah, Bradley was also the first political advisor to Uber and was instrumental in developing their strategy to disrupt the incumbent taxi monopolies. This is one, if not the most fascinating story in regulatory hacking in our times. He's also the author of a fantastic book that you should all read called The Fixer: My Adventures of Saving Startups from Death by Politics. Bradley, I'm super excited to have you here. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Bradley, for background, so I'm also the founder of Infinita VC with a similar thesis with a
Yep.
different flavor. I'm
Yep.
based in a special jurisdiction with, I believe, can be a better version of Dubai or the Cayman Islands combined for tech startups. And I invest in companies who could use it as a launchpad. That aside, in this episode, I'd like to focus on your work and background. So can you tell us a bit more of how you got into policy in the first place?
Yeah, sure. So depending on how far back you're willing to go, it's actually not a bad story, which is so when I grew up, I was interested in politics, but I wasn't connected in any way. I'm a first generation American. My family didn't really know anybody. But when I was 18, so this was the summer of 1992, the Democratic National Convention that summer was at Madison Square Garden. It was the Bill Clinton nominating convention. And my dad had a friend who was a lawyer for the Carpenters Union. And this guy, Brian O'Dwyer, said to me, he knew I was interested in politics, would you like a Carpenters one day pass to the convention? I said, great. So he said, okay, come by my office, pick it up. I do. And I look in the newspaper, and even today, it still says, if you look up when is the convention, it technically says like midnight, noon to midnight. Now, in reality, nothing gets going until about 8 p.m., but, I don't know that. So I show up at the garden. It's noon. There's no one there. It's like some guy running for state rep in Montana giving a speech. But Ed Rendell, who at the time was the mayor of Philadelphia, was sitting in the audience by himself. I had just finished my freshman year at Penn, so I was in school at Philly, and I thought, you know what? Let me say hi to him. Worst case, he'll blow me off. And now knowing Rendell, he was probably literally talking to the empty chair until someone got there anyway. So I go over to him. We have a really good conversation. 10, 15 minutes pass. I kind of realize I've taken enough of his time. I thank him. And he said, are you busy when you get back to school? And I said, no, not really. He said, would you like an internship? I said, oh, that'd be great. He said, okay, send me a note. We'll set it up. So I go home. I write a letter. I mail it in. And every day I'm checking the mailbox, waiting for his letter back. And what I don't know then, but I know now, is that correspondence is the black hole of government, right? Everything goes in, nothing comes out. And so never hear from him. I get back to school, and it kind of shows you how naive I was. This is, I just decide I'll go see him. And this is a decade before 9/11, so security is not what it is today. So I get to City Hall, I go inside, I find his office. I get to like his outer office, not like his direct assistant, but like the kind of people at reception. And I asked a question, which in retrospect was a crazy thing to ask, which was, is the mayor here? Right. And obviously you can't just go and ask to see the mayor of Philadelphia. And the people who ask that usually are one of two things: either people who are protesting, which I wasn't, or lunatics, which I wasn't. I was just a sort of sweet, gullible kid. And they said, he's a little busy. Do you want to leave a note? And I said, okay, sure. So I write a note, and then I get back on the subway to go back to the door. It hits me like, you idiot, you can't just do that. Forget it. This will never happen. And then I'm sitting in the dorm, and about 15 minutes later, the phone rings. And they said, please hold for the mayor. And he said, when are you coming to work? I said, I'll be right there. And I worked for him all through college. That's how I got started in politics. And then did a bunch of different jobs. I was the spokesman at the New York City Parks Department. I went to work for Chuck Schumer when he was U.S. Senator. I was his communications director in the U.S. Senate. I was the deputy governor of Illinois, ran the state's budget, operations, legislation, policy, and communications. Worked for Mike Bloomberg at City Hall in New York, ran Bloomberg's mayoral campaign in 2009. Started my first company in 2010, consulting firm that runs big campaigns. And as you said, I pivoted to tech kind of by accident. I'm sitting in a meeting early 2011, and a friend of mine called and said, hey, there's a guy with a small transportation startup. He's having some regulatory problems. Would you mind talking to him? I become Uber's first political advisor that day. I get really lucky when Travis calls me back and says, hey, listen, I can't afford your fee, would you take equity? I had no idea what equity meant at the time, but thank God I said yes. That was back during the Series A, and then spent the better part of the next few years running campaigns all over the U.S. to legalize Uber and ride sharing.
Fantastic. So we'll get much more into that. Before we do, now that you're have bridged sort of the policy and technology world, which is, by the way, also similar to my story. I started my career sort of in policy think tanks in Washington, D.C., actually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I learned
Which
that it
ones?
wasn't AEI and
Yep, sure.
CSIS.
Got it.
Mm-hmm.
Was Arthur Brooks at AEI when you were there?
Yeah, he was
What's he
there.
like? I'm always a
He's
fan of
great.
his. Yeah, I've never met him, but
I,
I'm a fan of his.
I found him really, really nice. I met him at dinner, took a picture with him. I found him really inspiring.
Yeah, I
Charles
like his work
Murray
a
as
lot.
well. I learned a lot from him.
I know who he is, but I've never met him. Yeah, interesting.
Yeah. And then I got into tech, into startups. So how do you now explain policy to startup entrepreneurs? What are kind of the most common misconceptions?
I think the good news is some of the misconceptions have improved and changed a little bit. So there was this moment, I would say maybe like in the mid-teens, when I would talk to a founder and they would say to me, and I'd explain like, okay, if you succeed at this thing, you're disrupting these people, these people, these people. Here's what they're going to do politically to you. Here's how you hit back. And they said, no, you don't understand. I went to Stanford. I was in Y Combinator. John Doerr's on my board. And when those stupid regulators see how smart I am, they're going to do whatever I want. Really, they did not know what they didn't know. And I'd have to explain to them that, that's just not how politics works. And nobody in politics could care less where he went to school or that he was in Y Combinator, who invested in his companies. They care about politics. As Uber and Airbnb and a bunch of other companies went through long public regulatory battles, those perceptions started to change a little bit. What I have found is, my fund invests in seed and Series A companies in highly regulated industries where we're looking for the same thing as you and every other early stage investor. We're looking at the TAM, we're looking at the founder, we're looking at the underlying concept and technology. But then we ask two questions that are somewhat unique to us. The first is there a gating regulatory issue or opportunity that if it were solved can really drive growth and valuation? And if so, can we solve it? And when the answer is yes to both, that's really what makes sense for us to invest. So we invested in FanDuel. We ran all the campaigns to legalize daily fantasy sports betting. We invested in Lemonade. We got them their insurance licenses everywhere. We invested in Roman. We legalized prescription via text. And so one thing that I have learned is, I meet with founders all day, is I just want founders who know what they don't know. They don't have to understand politics, but they have to appreciate that it has the same existential risk as bad engineering or bad marketing or anything else. And if they don't take it seriously and have the resources and expertise they need, it can kill their company just like anything else. And so I'm at least looking for people to be open-minded enough to get that.
Yeah. So you've put up also a guide, which is called the 10 Rules That Demystify Politics.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that? And afterwards, I have one challenge to that or a question.
Okay, sure. Yeah. I mean, look, so as I mentioned, I've seen government politics in the U.S. from every angle, right? I've worked in city government, state government, federal government, executive branch, legislative branch. I'm a lawyer, so I kind of get the judiciary. I've done it in New York and D.C. and Philly and Illinois. And, my consulting firm has run campaigns in all 50 states. And the thing I took away from all of that is one simple point. Every policy output is the result of a political input. Every politician makes every decision solely based on reelection and nothing else. And because in the U.S., because of gerrymandering, we live in a world where only the primaries really matter. So typically 10 to 15% of voters, usually the most extreme, the most ideological, or those dominated by special interests, tend to both pick our elected officials and then dictate everything we do. And so my thesis is you've got to align the inputs and the outputs, right? So Uber is the perfect example here, which is you're a city council member in Tulsa, Oklahoma, or literally pick any city you want. And the taxi guys give you a couple $1,000s in campaign contributions per campaign cycle. All things being equal, you're going to do what they want because you want the campaign money. Then all of a sudden, when you did what they wanted, I had 6,000 people from your district call, email, text, tweet, say, leave this thing alone. I want it. And we changed the inputs exponentially, right? All of a sudden, the right input wasn't do what the taxi guys want. The right input was do what your constituents want. And that's how we won in every single market in the country. And so to me, the first question is, can you align the political incentives and the policy outcomes to those that you want? And if so, how do you do it?
Yeah, I found that very compelling. One question that I had was, how does it apply to federal agencies, right? Because these are typically not elected or get votes.
Yeah,
And these seem to me, but feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, that are sort of the biggest challenge to many tech
yes
startups.
and no. So we've had a lot of success on the rulemaking process from federal agencies, whether it's Treasury or Labor or DOT. But a few things. One is, the rulemaking process is a public forum, and if you can mobilize enough support and enough voices and make them loud enough, that is still heard by the agency and by the secretary. The other thing is, they work for a politician, right? So in this case, they work for the president of the United States. They've been appointed by the president. And if the White House thinks that a decision they're going to make is going to cause them political harm, they're going to call and say, don't do this, or what are you doing, or whatever else. And so your audience, even though the people you need to ultimately sway may be a mid-level regulator at the U.S. Department of the Interior, your audience in many ways is the White House, right, or the president's political team. And you're trying to convince them to intercede and make sure that you can get what you need.
For sure, there's all sorts of ways in which you can influence the regulators or the politicians at the right level. Now, please tell us about how you started Tusk Strategies and the Uber story. And for background, this podcast is focused on this topic, right? And your story is key to what we're aiming to learn here, not just from an intellectual point of view, but also looking for practical insights for entrepreneurs that want to do the same. So take all the time you need to tell the story.
Yeah. So Tusk Strategies is a political consulting firm, but it's a little different than the other ones that I'm aware of out there, in that when I kind of surveyed the marketplace, I saw two things. I saw lots of firms that specialized in one skill set. They were great pollsters or ad makers or digital, website makers, whatever it was. And they would do it for politicians and in campaigns all over the country, but they just did one thing. Or you had firms that could run a whole campaign, but they only did it in one jurisdiction. They would do it in Sacramento or Albany or DC or whatever it was. And my thought was, what if you could run a whole campaign everywhere, right? Wouldn't that be of value to really high-end customers who have a lot at stake? And so Tusk Strategies was, and I think still is in many ways, the first campaign firm that runs campaigns soup to nuts, multifaceted. Inside game, which is typically lobbying; outside game, which is earned media, paid media, social media, grassroots, polling, opposition research, digital, and merges them all into one single campaign in all 50 states, in hundreds of cities, in Washington and other countries if we need to. And so that's what we built. And so Uber originally came to me because they were operating in San Francisco. They came to New York, immediately got hit with a cease and desist letter from the Taxi and Limousine Commission here in New York, and needed to know what to do about it. But ultimately, because the skill set that I had and what Uber needed really replicated itself everywhere, we ended up working in dozens of cities all over the country using effectively the same playbook, which was, we realized that we could mobilize our customers and turn them into political advocates and counter the lobbying weight and the political donations that the taxi industry made with real people. We could change the underlying political inputs. The very first one we did wasn't even in New York. It was in Washington, D.C. There was a bill introduced at the behest of the taxi industry that would have banned like the use of an iPhone, and they just basically found 50 ways to describe what Uber did and banned each one of those things. And we would have put us out of business. And this was really early on. We didn't even really have the whole sort of system down yet, but we sent an email to all 50,000 customers that existed in DC at the time from Travis Kalanick, who was then the founder and CEO, and said, listen, if you like this service, you need to reach out to your local council member. Here's their names, here's their phone numbers, here's their email, because otherwise they're going to take it away from you. And you know this because you lived in DC. before Uber, getting a taxi in DC was just awful, right? They have this crazy zone system that makes no sense and just rips off the customers. The taxis are in terrible shape. The driver's smoking half the time within it. They make you share it with strangers. Like really one of the worst systems in the country. And so therefore, once people in DC or any market saw what the alternative was, that, oh, I could just press a button, the car will come to wherever I am. I get in it. The driver is polite and pleasant. The car is clean. And then I get out and the deals or transactions are already handled for me. They didn't want to go back to the old way, right? And thousands and thousands and thousands of people heeded the call and reached out to their elected officials. And so much so that we not only defeated the bad bill unanimously in the city council, we introduced our own bill and passed it unanimously. And that was the first time that we really tried rallying our customers and ended up doing it in pretty much every market in the US. And it worked. And because you asked me to give practical advice to the listeners, it works in some situations. So you may be familiar that TikTok recently tried this with Congress, and it didn't really work, although it probably slowed them down to a certain extent. I have done this, or we have done this successfully a couple of times for FanDuel, for Bird, for Ease, but it only works with a few criteria. The first is it really works much better at the state or local level than it does at the federal level. Members of Congress can get thousands of pieces of email or calls about a post office renaming, let alone a major piece of legislation. So it is much harder to intimidate them. But a state senator or state rep might only hear about a particular bill from 9 people. So all of a sudden, if you just had 900 people weigh in, like that's a tsunami for them. So one is the level of government really matters. 2, the customers have to be really passionate about your product. One of the harder conversations that I have to have with founders is when they say, oh, do the thing you did for Uber for me. And I have to say, listen, you have a great company. It's profitable. It has a good trajectory to an IPO. But no one's that passionate about this thing. No one's going to take time out of their day to advocate for you politically. So what worked for Uber, what worked for FanDuel is not going to work for you. So that's number 2. And then number 3, it really helps when it is an issue that at the end of the day, the politicians don't see as existential to them, right? So one of the reasons why we're able to win everywhere for FanDuel is, again, just like the taxis, the casino industry gives out lots of money to lots of politicians, and they use that to collect political chits in favor. But, we would meet with a state rep in, say, Tennessee or literally anywhere and say, listen, between DraftKings and FanDuel, you have 4,312 customers in your district. Let's be honest. They don't know who you are. They don't even probably know what a state rep is. But they love fantasy sports betting. And if you take it away from them, we are going to make sure that every single one of them knows, and we're going to register them to vote. I'm going to turn them out in your next election, and you're going to lose. And they all had the same reaction, which was like, screw it. I don't care about fantasy sports. Like, I'm not risking my seat over this thing. And they backed down. If our issue had been abortion, it would have been different. So, you need a very specific set of criteria. You mentioned my first book, The Fixer. And it does have a lot on the specific question of begging for forgiveness or asking for permission. It gets into a lot more detail if you're interested, but it only works if the criteria line up right. And more often than not, that's not the case.
Yeah, please go a bit more into the asking for forgiveness rather than permission part, because it seems to me that the strategy works if the company has already a product in the market, right? But for many companies, that's already the first hurdle because there's like pre-market approvals or things like that.
Yeah, so it just depends on what sector you're in, right? So like, and what is at risk, right? So for Bird scooters, kind of the worst that could happen is they'd impound the scooter. Annoying, you lose the $150 it costs to make it, but not that big a deal, right? Whereas like for Lemonade Insurance in the US, if you sell insurance without a license, you go to jail for that. They take that very seriously. And so, while Lemonade's customers were actually pretty passionate about the product, by the time we had customers in our jurisdiction, it had already been resolved because either we'd gotten the license or we hadn't gotten it, or we got it everywhere. So we got the license. But depending on the sequencing of your action, if you need a government permit or license to operate in the first place, and if the stakes are really high, right? So again, with Uber, they impound the vehicle, not the end of the world. If you've got a crypto company and the SEC tries to put you in jail for 7 to 10 years, you really don't want that, right? And so you got to understand both the risk that you're taking and the sequencing. And I will say, like you mentioned, if you don't have a tangible product or service that customers can point to and want to hold on to, they'll never advocate for you because they don't advocate for intangible concepts. They advocate for specific products and services.
Yeah, yeah. And maybe you can illustrate that also with a company that I also had on this podcast with Oklo, right? Because in their case, they don't, or it's very hard to get first customers, right? They might have a couple of letters of intent, but they're looking at this like very lengthy approval process with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So how are you helping them, or what?
Yeah, so they're actually
You can
not.
talk
You
about it.
mentioned before they're not a portfolio company of ours or a client or anything like
Okay,
that.
maybe I'm confusing that.
So,
Yeah.
but nonetheless, it's a really fascinating topic and one that I have thought about. And I teach this stuff at Columbia Business School, and we've talked about this specific issue in my class. Yeah, I mean, in their case, what they've got to be able to do is, if you have something meaningfully different from the current approach to nuclear waste storage or something else, is you can't take the people who are benefiting from your product or service and rally them, because your product or service doesn't exist in the marketplace yet until you get approvals. So you've got to find people who agree with you ideologically, who are advocates for nuclear power, right? Or hate nuclear waste that's disposed of in a certain way, and you're doing it in a different way. And so you have to find people who are already bought into this issue. So for them, they get it. They're already invested in it. It's not intangible and conceptual to them. It's real to them. And that's who you have to mobilize. So, in those cases, you've got to find someone else who cares. The good news is, in an issue like nuclear, it does stir a lot of passions. So there are a lot of people on both sides of the issue. So there are people that you can go to. I think where it gets even harder is in a total white space, AI, machine learning, drones, crypto, autonomous vehicles, where there really isn't much advocacy on one side or the other, because there's no one's done this thing before yet, right? And sometimes our work is sort of the Uber FanDuel variety, where we're disrupting an entrenched interest. The entrenched interest uses political force to try to stop us, and then we've got a regulatory fight, but it's really a fight over market share through the guise of regulation. But when it's in a white space completely, it's less about who are you fighting, and it's more about how are you creating the right regulatory framework so that this thing can operate. People think that they want no regulation at all, and they call themselves libertarians. But the reality is, you can't really build successful multi-billion-dollar companies in the absence of all rules and regulation. You typically need some structure to do that. And so you've got to figure out how to work with the other companies in the sector, the regulators, everyone else, on how to do that. And by the way, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So if you just take two issues at the U.S. Department of Transportation on drones and also on eVTOL, they've made some real progress, right? And those are two industries that are brand new. And while I don't think the FAA is sort of setting any speeds for innovation, they're open to it, right? And they're willing to work with the drone companies. They're willing to work with the eVTOL companies. And as a result, there's been a thoughtful process of consensus around making the right rules. Doesn't mean there's not contention sometimes, but it's productive, right? Whereas I'm an investor in a company called Kodiak, which is an autonomous trucking company. And the US DOT for 7 years now has failed to issue any sort of rules or requirements around interstate autonomous trucking. And trucking is an interstate operation in the US completely. And if there are no rules that say, here's what happens when the truck crosses over from Illinois into Indiana, you can't do it. And the reason why is the Teamsters don't like autonomous trucking because they think it will ultimately put them out of work. Now, their thesis is pretty off because there's a massive, massive shortage of truckers. And so it's not like this is going to displace any human beings. And a company like Kodiak is mid-mile trucking, which means you're driving straight on I-10 for 1,000 miles in one lane. This enables the trucker to take a nap as opposed to having to sort of, stay awake by ingesting massive amounts of caffeine or drugs or anything else like that. So it makes the road a lot safer. But, the Teamsters don't like it. Trump considered himself a Teamsters guy, so his DOT didn't do anything. Biden considers himself a Teamsters guy, so his DOT doesn't do anything. And as a result, even though the FAA and DOT are part of the same ultimate agency, within that one agency, you have this cognitive dissonance where one part of the agency has completely stymied innovation and change and progress, and another part of the agency has advanced it, simply because sometimes the politics line up right and sometimes they don't.
Okay, so in this case, were you able to find a way forward for that autonomous trucking company?
No. So we have been able to help that company get permission to operate intrastate. So they operate within a California, within a Texas, within a Florida. They've even signed up, ironically, the federal government, the U.S. Defense Department as a customer. So they're even selling into the federal government, which is crazy, considering that the holdup is also happening from the federal government, but it's a giant bureaucracy and the pieces aren't necessarily connected. And one of the things I learned from that was an investment we made out of Fund 1. We're currently investing out of Fund 3, is I no longer will make an investment if the only solution from a regulatory standpoint requires a federal outcome. When the phrase an act of Congress is synonymous with a miracle, I can't base a strategy on a miracle.
That's just too hard to do.
Yeah, whereas with states, there's 50 of them, and I've got room to run, and I can fail on some and go on others. I can try a red state strategy. I could try a blue state strategy. I could try a regional strategy. I could figure out what works and then sort of make adjustments. But I've got enough bites at the apple that I can make something happen. Whereas in the federal government, when it's one of one, it's a lot harder.
Okay, very interesting. Could you talk a bit more about the Lemonade case study? And I'm asking because I'm very interested in insurance in general, right?
Sure.
So how to get carrier licenses and things like that. You already mentioned.
Yeah. So Lemonade is a property and casualty insurer that provides really high quality, low cost insurance to its customers. That can all be done online through the app. You don't have to call anyone. They pay their claims instantaneously. And my partner Jordan met Daniel Schreiber. Daniel was the co-founder and CEO of Lemonade. And Daniel was frustrated because they were trying to get a license in New York to sell insurance and just couldn't get anywhere with bureaucrats at all. And Jordan connected me to Daniel. I said, Daniel, how are you going about this? He said, oh, well, we've got our lawyers talking to the regulators. It's never going bottom up in this case is never going to work, right? Because the bureaucrats at the State Department of Financial Services, one, don't want to have to do more work, right? They don't want to have to figure out an entirely new model and deal with it. And two, there's this thing called regulatory capture where weirdly regulators become protective of the people that they're regulating, and they actually block competition for those companies. And so between regulatory capture and just the general desire not to have to do more work, they're going to stall this forever. It's got to come top down. And at the time, Andrew Cuomo was the governor of New York. And we ran a campaign aimed at Cuomo and the legislature and the media. And finally, it ended with me calling over to someone in the Cuomo world saying, listen, you tell them that tomorrow the Wall Street Journal is going to have one of two stories. It's either going to be insurance, startup leaves New York because of Cuomo's corruption and bureaucracy, or new low-cost insurer improved by Cuomo to deliver benefits to New Yorkers. You decide. We got a license 24 hours later. We then had to go to all other 49 states and repeat the process, and it differed in every single state, right? So in California, it actually was bottoms up. And once we had that imprimatur and approval from DFS in New York, that gave us a lot of credibility, with regulators in other states. And so we're just going through the process. In Texas, true to their kind of, we love business reputation, I called the governor's chief of staff, and his response was basically, what time do you want to pick up your license? In Florida, they didn't object to it, but it was literally illegal. And we had to pass a law that's known as the Lemonade Law in Florida that said, okay, you can do this. In Pennsylvania, the reserve requirements were greater than the cap of the Lemonade had access to, and we had to lower the reserve requirements so that Lemonade could be licensed. So, the work differed in every state, but again, to the point before about autonomous trucking, we could go state by state and solve each problem, as opposed to just, if we couldn't fix it, we were just stuck forever.
Yeah. So in each state, the requirements to form an insurance carrier company were just very high, right? So you had to go to each one of
Yep,
them
high and
to look.
and a little different in each place
Mhm,
too.
mhm. Okay, they were so high that it was just too hard for new startups to form, to get a license.
It was too hard for Lemonade, which was a well-funded competitor. Sequoia had already invested, Olive had already invested. It was too hard for them to get regulators to say, "Yeah, we're just going to authorize this new form of competition." But that's why we exist as a fund, right? We are able to provide solutions and answers to our portfolio companies' problems and questions that no one else can do because we understand politics, we understand regulation, we understand media, we understand government. The reason why we typically win whatever deal we compete for is simply that I'm able to provide something of value to my portfolio companies that they can't get anywhere else. So typically speaking, call it something like, I'll say, okay, if you succeed, you're going to have this problem, this problem, this problem, and this problem. And then you have one of two ways to approach it. You could hire a political consulting firm like mine and pay them $1 million and hope that they can solve it for you. Or I can give you $5 million and do it for free. Which would you prefer? As you can imagine, we win most of our deals.
Yeah. Also, that's kind of amazing. You're saying like you help pass a lemonade law in Florida. So does it also mean that helped then other startups to get insurance carrier
Sometimes,
licenses?
yeah. I mean, so look, my goal, to be very clear, is to ensure that the companies that I invest in succeed. I am not some sort of, ambassador for an entire industry in any case. So where we can build regulatory moats that lock in an advantage for our specific portfolio companies, we will do so. But oftentimes, you're right. We're paving the way for the rest of the industry. I mean, I remember the first time, or the only time I met John Zimmer, who's the founder of Lyft. I was at a dinner. He was there, and there was sort of no avoiding him. But I was nervous because he and Travis hated each other, and Travis had fucked with him relentlessly. And I was like, I was known as a Travis guy, and I was like, oh, he's going to hate me. And so I went over to him and I just said, "Hi, I'm the devil." And he laughed and said, "No, you're not." He said, "You did all the heavy lifting and all the dirty work, and we just skated in right behind you every time." And I was like, "You're absolutely right." And it wasn't that we didn't want to come up with a way to prevent Lyft from taking advantage of what we were doing, but we couldn't because our models were just too similar, right? So sometimes you can come up with a regulatory moat, but sometimes you can't.
Yeah, I think that's really amazing. And if there were, I think you're really trailblazing there. And I think it would be great if there's more funds that do that, because these can also gradually roll back much of the regulatory capture, like in favor or like as advocacy for tech startups,
Yeah,
right?
I mean,
That don't usually.
look. I'm not sure that I'm wishing for a lot of competition, but I would say that I see our work twofold, right? One is to first and foremost, create returns for our LPs, but also generally speaking, I think we're a little bit of a deterrent to bad behavior by entrenched interests and by regulators, because in knowing that we exist and knowing that we're willing to sort of take on the fight politically and really disrupt and make people look bad, a lot of times, various forms of corruption that might be used aren't employed because we're a deterrent to that. So, I like to think of ourselves as playing that role.
Yeah, yeah. So I think you mentioned that you're not investing or doing biotech or anything that
Yeah.
touches the FDA. So how did you come to
It,
that
it's it's
decision?
it's because it's funny. It's not because it isn't regulated. It's because it's regulated in such a specific way that I didn't think I had a competitive advantage. Right? Prescription drugs are obviously require a lengthy FDA process, but it's a very prescribed process. It works in very specific ways. And my view was there are biotech funds that have been around for decades, right? That really understand how to do this very well, and I wasn't going to bring anything to the table that was meaningfully better than what they could do. Whereas if all of a sudden your product gets banned overnight in 18 states, we're the only ones that can handle that right now, right? And so to me, it's about figuring out the arbitrage and where my fund has a true competitive advantage over others, and where I don't think we have that advantage, like in biotech, we stay out of it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, in biotech there, it's hard to see like the advantage how you could kind of accelerate the process, right? So regulatory capture in biotech really has led to development times rising from like 6 months to 10 years.
Yeah.
Right.
Now, we did once on the consulting side run a campaign at the FDA that did work. It was for a company called Roivant, which was founded by Vivek Ramaswamy, who then ran for president. And they had an Alzheimer's drug. And Vivek's point to me was, listen, the FDA hasn't approved anything new on Alzheimer's in decades because there are these two clinical endpoints that have to be met in order to get approved, and no one has been able to meet them for decades. The standard is too strict. It's not helping patients. If there's no new medicines on the horizon, they should be willing to accept, fulfillment of one endpoint rather than two. And we built a campaign where we mobilized people in the Alzheimer's world, family members, friends, all that stuff. And we ran a pretty broad-based, public campaign, and it worked in the sense that the FDA did agree to change their approach to measuring Alzheimer's drugs. The problem was, even though they were willing to just take, validation on one of the two clinical endpoints, the Roivant drug failed to meet either of them, so it still failed anyway. So that was my one experience in the space. So, there may be edge cases where you can do something, but I think you're right. Generally speaking, it's very prescribed and often, not aimed at furthering innovation.
Yeah. I mean, that's what I'm doubling down on now. And I'm curious, before we get there, what's been your experience, or what do you see the potential for kind of offshore innovation to circle back? And I'm thinking of the example of Zipline, the drone company that had the first commercial operations in Rwanda.
Yeah.
And then kind of use that to...
I think sadly that's going to often have to be the case, which really shouldn't be, right? It should be that we are able to test out new ideas and new technologies here in the US and benefit from them. But there are times where the regulatory climate here is so onerous and so bureaucratic or so controlled by the entrenched interests that it is actually easier to just go ahead and do your testing and do your work in other countries, prove that it could work, and then bring it back. I'll give you a corollary. Out of my foundation, I've been funding and running the effort to make mobile voting possible in the US so that people can vote in elections on their phones. We are at the tail end of building our own mobile voting technology, which I'm going to make free and open source to anyone who wants to use it. And my guess is I may get more takers in the early days in other countries than I get here in the US. And I may have to prove out the product safety by running elections in Rwanda or Honduras or whatever it is before I can do it in the U.S. So we're obviously going to try to do it everywhere we can. But yeah, when we are thinking about a strategy for a portfolio company, we will certainly think about that. And by the way, oftentimes, if our view is you can't get this off the ground in the U.S. from a regulatory perspective, we likely just won't make the investment in the first place.
Okay. So using kind of offshore as a deliberate strategy is not so much what you're focused on, but you've seen it and it can be done.
It certainly can be done. It can be a good proof of concept to make the case. So yeah, it's worthwhile, but I would say that if you are looking at an early stage tech company and the only way for them to make their regulatory case is to do it offshore first, I think you got to look pretty hard at whether or not they're going to have the bandwidth to survive, right? So, is that a feasible strategy with enough money and time? Sure. But if you have to prove something out in Rwanda and hope that the people in the U.S. notice and eventually use that to change their minds, that's going to take a while. And if your burn rate is such that, you have 12 or 18 months of runway or whatever it is, and then you're out and you have to get a positive result before those 12 or 18 months are up, that's probably not going to happen, in which case that strategy doesn't really work.
Yeah. Well, other jurisdictions can be much cheaper, right, to operate
in. Yeah, that's true. That's true, for sure.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of the case that I'm trying to prove now, kind of building a biotech healthcare jurisdiction here that can then sort of be an argument also to get access and approval in the United States, right? So that's kind of the niche I'm focusing on now. And it's interesting, and we'll see how it works, right? So we have one company that's far along in the process. that's also submitting their data for FDA approval, but that has tested their development, their drug here, the clinical trials according to the book. But they're also talking to other jurisdictions like Dubai, Mexico, Japan. So that's definitely a very interesting process. And especially I think health and biotech is just so strongly captured by the regulators that I think that is definitely one way that we definitely need to find new ways. I'm curious from your work, you must wonder sometimes, what are things you'd like more entrepreneurs, or what you'd like entrepreneurs to do or focus on, opportunities that you see to
Yeah, I mean, I think that what I would like entrepreneurs to realize is that, the vast majority of companies are regulated in some way. And, rather than saying, oh, I don't want to deal with it, you'll figure it out. Right. And yeah, it takes time and effort and money and expertise, but just like you need the same amount of time and money expertise to figure out the marketing for a product or to figure out the engineering for a product or anything else, don't shy away from something just because it's a regulated market. So I think that's number one. But then number two, at the same time, don't assume that politicians and regulators behave rationally or use the same set of inputs and incentives and thinking that you do. The way they think might be radically different. It might be logical for them, but illogical to you. And if you just apply your mindset to them and assume that that's how they'll behave as well, or that there's something wrong with them if they don't think about it the way you do, you're probably going to fail.
Are there specific industries or areas that you think are untapped by entrepreneurs?
I think there are some where there's still a lot of opportunity for development. So, for example, one area that I've been looking at more lately is defense tech. And the reason I haven't done anything on this so far is simply that, U.S. Department of Defense procurement is a very, very prescribed, specific process. There are people who have real expertise in it. Neither I nor anyone on my team has that expertise. And therefore, kind of like the FDA point earlier, I didn't feel like we had a meaningful advantage that would make sense to invest in. But what we're now seeing are dual usage technologies that can be used by the DoD, but also used by city government, by state government, by utilities, by private companies, by consumers. And as a result, in those cases, all of a sudden, it does fit into our wheelhouse, right? So I think also sometimes the same underlying technology can be productized and marketed to different segments of the economy and the customer base in different ways. And it's worth thinking broadly about that.
Yeah. I'm wondering, do you have any views kind of on the macro level, and what's happening on net when it comes to new regulation, and you able to be fight back, right? Because there's all sorts of new regulations all the time, right? So we might get more regulations on crypto or on AI, right? So there's new bills passed at quite regularly, and there's not that many of you out there that are fighting
No.
back.
Yeah, for sure. Look, I mean, I think that one is you've got to be aware, and this isn't just for startups. I'm telling this to trade associations and big companies too. So, everyone is fascinated by AI, as we should be, and everyone tends to sort of overlook state and local government and just focus on what's happening in Washington. And the answer is nothing's happening in Washington, right? They'll have listening sessions and a lot of procedural nonsense around AI for years and years. And get nothing done. But over 300 AI bills have been introduced in state legislatures this year, and some of those are going to pass, right? And some of those might be good for the industry, some might be bad, some might be good for some players and not for others. But oftentimes we feel like people are focused on Washington, and therefore they're like, oh, well, there's no movement or anything this year, we don't have to worry. It's like, yes, you do. Because states pass legislation and cities pass legislation and counties pass legislation, and you've got to focus on it. So one is you've got to be aware of what's happening at all levels of government. Two is you've got to figure out when it makes sense to team up with your competitors to have a unified front on regulation, and when you want to be competing against them, in that area. Sometimes, especially for early stage companies, even though you may be bitter enemies in some ways, if the product isn't legal, it doesn't really matter. And if you're both need the product to be legal in order for you to even try to compete with each other, it may make sense to share resources, to join forces. With FanDuel, we did that with DraftKings, and it worked really well. So on the regulatory front, it may make sense to work with your peers and your competitors. At the same time, there are other companies say, oh, we're part of a trade association, they'll take care of it for us. No, they won't, right? You're one of many members. They're thinking about their needs, their issues. You are not their priority. And the notion that someone else is just inherently looking out for you and your best interest, like, that's not how life works.
Yeah. When are, or have you experienced founders going too far and sort of asking for forgiveness rather than permission? So what's the mental
I mean,
model you've had so
there are
far?
certainly, times that we're seeing that in crypto, right? Where there are ICOs that are offered, or there are new products and services offered by even companies like Coinbase, which are highly legitimate. They were a portfolio company of ours, that the SEC hasn't weighed in on yet. And you will see them getting in trouble because the SEC says we haven't issued any rules around this yet. And therefore the act that you're committing is a felony. Now, Coinbase has said very rightfully, you need to tell us what the rules are. We'll comply with them, but you can't make us live in the dark and not even know what it is we're supposed to comply with or not. And they're totally right about that. But at the same time, at least at the SEC that we have today, Gary Gensler, who is the head of the SEC, has decided that he's going to make his reputation, his political play by being anti-crypto. He is desperate for the support and embrace of Elizabeth Warren in the Senate, who is anti-crypto. His hope is that if Biden gets reelected, he will be the Treasury Secretary. He thinks his path to that is through Warren, and therefore he has become vociferously anti-crypto, not necessarily out of any real ideological belief about the concept one way or the other, but because he, like we talked about earlier, he's a politician and he acts in the best interest of himself, right? And policy outputs are shaped by political inputs. And for Gensler, the input is not what's best for crypto or what's best for that sector or the millions of people who trade it and use it. It's what's best for Gary Gensler. And you have to assume that that's how politicians are making their decisions.
Yeah, that must be so alienating when you're an entrepreneur in crypto and are hearing about these things for the first time. But
with that said, at this point, if you are an entrepreneur in crypto, you should go in with your eyes open, and you should understand that it is a highly regulated marketplace that is undeveloped. There is significant bias against you at the SEC level. What you think are the rules to be treated fairly are not necessarily how it's going to work. And so while I'm all for crypto, if you are starting a new company in the space, you should go into it with your eyes open.
Yeah. So the two key lessons from you that I think I remember most strongly are sort of focused on state and local and city level, rather than federal. And second, make your constituents work for you. Right. So I think these are really
when you can, but also understand that, like, even in the cases where you can get your constituents to advocate on your behalf, they're not going to do it every day, right? You get to ask them once or twice. And so don't waste it on stupid stuff, right? Don't assume that, that they're there for you and all they're doing is figuring out how can I help this founder, right? They're there for themselves, like every human being. They're focused on their own lives, on their jobs, their kids, their families, their health. And they may once or twice send an email on your behalf, but understand that they're not going to do it a lot. So, use the power sparingly.
Yeah. I think, and I have some hope that even in the United States that can work for biotech and healthcare, right? So there is a patient rights movement. There is groups of patients that want access to certain drugs that are in trials. And some states, including Montana, for example, are coming forward with more right to try laws. I think Trump himself has suggested more expanded right to try laws, right? So there might be potential for that in Florida. So I think that's something that can be.
I would say, look, I'm not a Trump fan, but I actually thought the FDA functioned reasonably well under him. And even though
Operation Warp Speed, right?
Yeah, it's funny. Even though he was kind of an anti-vaxxer and a nut about it in some ways, they did produce vaccines in record time that allowed the world to return to normal a lot sooner than it normally would have been. And generally speaking, I thought that the FDA under Trump was a little more open-minded and progressive in a way that I would like to see. So, I strongly believe the world would be better off with Biden than Trump. But I do think that, some of his policies around biotech were favorable.
Yeah. Last question. Why should entrepreneurs be excited about entering or starting a startup in a regulated industry and come to you for investment?
Because, well, two things. So first of all, there's two parts to that question. The first one is, if you want to create a startup that A, has a meaningful impact on society, and B, has a chance to have a meaningful liquidity event and exit, whether it's an M&A deal or an IPO, the vast majority of businesses are regulated either directly or indirectly in some way, right? If you touch a consumer in any way, shape, or form, there is a form of regulation. So yes, there are certain types of pure SaaS enterprise software that are not regulated, and there are firms that focus on that, and that's great. But the vast majority of companies are regulated. And then once that's the case for us, look, every founder makes their own decision, and like every VC fund, I'm sure, just like for every one deal we do, we turn down 99. But in the cases where we do want to invest in something, I am lucky in that we are able to give something to our portfolio companies in the form of regulatory and media services and help for free. That other founders, that other VCs aren't able to so far. And that does certainly give us an advantage.
Fantastic. Bradley, how can any listener that's interested in coming to you for your services or for funding find you? And if you can, again, repeat your criteria.
Yeah, sure. So probably the best thing is just to go to the Tusk Ventures website, because there's a lot of information about us on there, about how we work, about how to reach us and get your deck in front of our investment team. So that's probably the best way to do it. And then if you're more interested specifically in some of the stuff that I've been talking about, if you go to bradleytusk.com, you can find all kinds of stuff. I host a podcast called Firewall, also kind of about the intersection of tech and regulation. There are links to that. I write columns for the New York Daily News, and also I have a Substack. There are links to that. I've written a couple of books, The Fixers you mentioned, and then I wrote a novel that came out last November that is a tech regulatory novel. It is about a campaign to legalize flying cars in New York, LA, and Austin. On one side of the fight is Uber and Taxi United against it, the socialists, the Audubon Society, the transit unions, and the Russian mob. And the other side is the flying car startup and their vicious political consultants. And then I've got a new book on mobile voting called Vote with Your Phone coming out on September 17th. So, all the different work we do, the things out of my foundation, mobile voting, hunger. I own a independent bookstore in Manhattan with the only free podcast studio in New York that anyone can use. My class at Columbia Business School, or consulting firm, all the work that we do. If you're interested in that more broadly, if you go to bradleytusk.com, you can find it there.
Fantastic. Bradley, was really awesome to have you on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me, man. This was a really fascinating conversation.
Thanks for coming on. Really enjoyed this.
Thanks for having me. All right, man.